Nest.js got a ton of attention in the past few years, and the main reason is that they have built really good system that supports the legacy Express.js middlewares and pretty much entire code bases, and also built a modular microservice logic dependency injection style code base that pretty much can be extendable multiple teams even at the same time. Today we are going to look how to make cookie-based JSON Web Token authentication for Nest.js. That is going to be a separate module for Nest.js. You can plug it on your existing application, or that could be even a separate repository inside your organization. So let's get into it. We are starting a fresh new project to demonstrate how cookie authentication will work and how we can make it as a separate module. So let's make a new Nest.js application, and we will name this cookie JSON Web Token. So we are going to use npm and an installation in progress. So after installation is completed, I'm going to use the WebStorm to open up this project. So I'm using WebStorm as a main code editor but you can use, of course, VS Code, whichever available for you. This is a standard Nest.js application, and we can run our server by typing npm run start dev, and we will have the web server running. So in this application right now, we should add a separate logic for having this hello endpoint under the authentication. And whenever we have a cookie that has the JSON Web Token authentication, then we should proceed further, sending the hello message. Otherwise, it should be 401 unauthenticated response. To get started, first of all, we will need to install a couple of packages that we will use later on. And one of them is obviously the cookie parser, which is extended by Nest.js, but originally that was developed for Express.js, so it's almost the same middleware, and we're going to import that. Secondly, we will use the Passport and Passport JSON Web Token. Also, to include the Passport.js into Nest.js project, we have to have the Nest Passport. After having those packages installed, first of all, let's enable the configuration for having the Nest.js cookie parser. So we will just make sure that we have cookie parser, and we are going to make sure that we are using cookie parser. So this enables us to essentially parse and process cookies from browser request. And of course, we also have to have installed types, which is not mandatory, but sometimes the editors just complain a lot when you don't have installed package types. So after having this installed, we can make sure that the actual cookies will be parsed from requested browser, and we can use the request cookie object inside our controller to see whether we have properly formatted stuff as a cookies there or not. So for that, I'm going to use the standard directive of request inside the Nest.js. This will give us the request object that we can use for Nest.js. After having this written down to log the cookies itself from given request object, we can now test this directly inside our browser. I'll just spin up the Nest.js server, and inside our browser, I'll try to refresh. Now, if you can see, we got back an empty object because at the moment we don't have any cookies in our browser. So if I'm gonna add a cookie here by inserting the localhost 3000, let's say I'm adding a test cookie with the value something, and when I do refresh, cookie is persisted, and we got back a response from the server, and the cookies contain what we have actually set inside our browser. So this is the most important part of this entire project. Rest is just a JSON Web Token implementation that you can use whatever you like, even without cookies, with just plain authorization headers. But let's continue on building an actual JSON Web Token process here. So what we have to do now is to generate a new module called out. I'm going to use Nest.js command G module out. And this will create our authentication module and will automatically add it to the list of the modules here inside our main file. So we don't have to do anything else other than making this module. Besides this authentication module, inside we will have a separate file called JWT strategy, which is going to be a JSON Web Token strategy class that extends the Passport JSON Web Token that we can use to essentially parse the cookies and get back our response. So for that, let's create the class JSON Web Token strategy, which extends the Passport strategy. And for giving, we have to give an actual strategy here, which is going to be a Passport JSON Web Token strategy class extended from Passport JSON Web Token here, and it has a strategy class in it. Here we have also missing these types for Passport JWT. So we are going to install it now, because that will help us to avoid type conflicts, and it will actually bring the correct types. Now that we have extended the class, we have to write also a constructor function, which is coming from the Passport strategy. And for that, we have to use the super function, which is from a Passport strategy again. And here we also have the extract JSON Web Token, which is a generic function that extracts the JSON Web Token either from barrier token or from JSON Web Token prefix, depending on your use case. And here we have one little problem, that this JSON Web Token extractor essentially tries to get always from headers or from other sources, but not from cookies. And for that, we have to add a separate private function, which essentially tries to fetch user token, which is named for that, either from cookies, or it returns a null just to proceed on a second like header part of it. So this goes in a way that if we don't have a JSON Web Token inside our cookies, we'll try to get it from our headers. This way we will support both. And because we are not going to use a configuration service at the moment, you can use a simple secret key essentially to just add it. But in the production, of course, you're gonna add the configuration service. And the most important part here is that we have to make this code as an injectable to bring this component to our main module. Seems I'm getting this error underlined here, which says that this passport strategy is a callable function. Seems it is not an interface reference, but instead a function. So essentially this passport strategy returns back an instance type with the new. So that's what extendable for TypeScript. So the rest of the code base is essentially implemented already by Passport JS and the Nest.js Passport extensions. We just have to include this as a module provider and adding the passport strategy here. Ooh, we have to export, of course. Yeah, exporting passport strategy and then importing that here. Now we have the passport JSON Web Token strategy already imported. Let's try to start our server. Let's see if all types compile. Yes, everything is fine. The only part is that we are missing an actual Passport JS import, which will give the middleware access to an actual Passport JS functionality. And for that, we have to install another package, which is named the Nest.js JSON Web Token. This is essentially a wrapper around a standard JSON Web Token library that handles all of the parsing and processing of JSON Web Tokens to the object and the encryption process. So here inside the authentication module, we have to support the imports, and we have to import already the passport module, which should be registered as a default strategy JSON Web Token and without any sessions, because we don't need a session here. It's everything under the cookie. And another part is that we have to include JSON Web Token, which we have to register with the secret, the same secret that we have here, the configuration. That in general, that is going to be a configuration, but right now we don't care that much. And we can set the sign options, which should be expiring in 1 hour. So this is generally fine. We don't really need anything else other than this very simple configuration. And with this, we actually have pretty much everything that could support potentially the authentication process itself, but we are missing a key part, which is a guards to guard a specific endpoint with the JSON Web Token checking and sending the 401 unauthorized error or getting back the rest of the functionality with the context of what is user and what does the user object contain. And for that, let's make another file, name that as guard. And with these guards, we have to make another injectable export class JSON Web Token guard, which extends the out guard named JWT. So now whenever we have the implementation of some controller or route inside Nest.js, we can essentially safeguard this with the user guards JSON Web Token, and that will essentially execute this strategy to get back and check whether we have a correct JSON Web Token. If yes, then we can proceed with the standard validate function. If not, then it will throw an error. But here we are missing an actual validate function, which should in theory return back user information if our payload contains that. So, but because like we don't have any authentication checking things going on here, so we can essentially make a standard payload response with saying that, like, assuming that our payload will contain sub, which is a user ID and username inside the same payload. But that's just assumption. To make things a lot easier, let's just return a single user ID, which we will include inside payload as a user ID. So here we have to already like check whether we have a user in database, but because we don't have any of that, we just have to validate if JSON Web Token is correct using these wrapper functions. If yes, then we'll just send back wherever we have, just to make sure that we get back the same payload that we have in our cookie JSON Web Token strategy. The last part is to safeguard our controller with the JSON Web Token user guards, or you can do this for the single pod as well. Let's try it with entire controller, and here we have the user guard wrapper by Nest.js coming by default, and we can essentially assign that to a JSON Web Token guard to make sure that our request that comes from browser contains the cookie information that we need. So now let's start our server, and we will see that when we reload the browser, we get unauthorized message, meaning that we probably don't have a JSON Web Token cookie here that qualifies all of the parameters that we need. And the same happens actually when I'm wrapping a single function here, which is get hello, but the next function might be just without it, meaning that this one will be a private endpoint, and this one is going to be a public endpoint. And let's name this properly. So now when I go into a private endpoint, I get the same error message, but when I go to public, everything works. So the last part here is to add another endpoint that will generate our JSON Web Token without needing all of that complicated stuff for the login process. First of all, let's make our JSON Web Token secret as a exportable static parameter, just so that we can use that for importing that inside the rest of our application. That's not pretty, but that's the easiest way now. I don't want to go into having the entire configuration set up now. So we can use JWT secret TMP, and this is for you to understand that this is just a temporary. So we will just use this variable across our application wherever we need our secret, because we already have enabled our JSON Web Token strategy. So I'm gonna create a new controller here called the auth controller TS. This controller essentially will be our kind of login and logout logic, and I'm gonna make injectable export class out controller. So this is going to be an actual authentication controller. We will have the endpoints written here. And for basic usage, what we're gonna do is to add a JSON Web Token service. And because we already have the authentication module enabled and JSON Web Token module loaded here from Nest.js JWT token, we can use JSON Web Token service to sign and send back a response to our services. So what we're gonna do, we add another endpoint here, which could be get, like we don't care that much. Let's make this controller seems, and the controller is going to be with the out prefix, and let's make this login. So this is what we are going to send back to the client. It is just a username and ID. That is going to be our JSON Web Token payload. And by signing this, we send back our access token that is going to be as well imported as a cookie from our front end. Now we should import our authentication controller here as a standard controller, and that should be it. We should be able now to get back the authenticated cookie. Let's just restart our server and try out our new out login endpoint. Oops, out login. Yes. As you can see, we got back a proper version of our JSON Web Token. Now what we're gonna do is to set user token cookie variable with the JSON Web Token that we just got, and that should be enough to get back a proper response. But now since we are getting again unauthorized, this seems to be issue that we named wrong the barrier token. So let's go back here inside JSON Web Token strategy, and seems yes, we have to have a barrier token instead of JSON Web Token. You can change this a bit, tweak. Okay, we get back again an issue. Let's see if we have everything in place. Yes, we have a user token where barrier is our JSON Web Token. Now let's try again here to see what's going on. So we have JSON Web Token strategy. I'm gonna set here a console log to see if we actually getting back a proper cookies here in the private mode. This is the process of debugging that, yes, we get back proper JSON Web Token. Now let's see what's going on then. Oh, okay. So because we don't have any barrier extraction here, we just kind of clean up user token and expect to get back only user token. So we don't need this barrier. This barrier is required for an HTTP authorization header, but with cookies that should be pretty much without the variable. So now you can see that we have a public endpoint and private endpoint, both of them working. And now when I try to remove this user token, the public still works, but the private will be 401. Now let's try to login again, out login, and copy over the user token here. And try reloading again. And this is now works. So the next thing, the most important part here is that whenever we make a login request, we actually have to set that cookie directly instead of trying to set that from the browser, because that's usually how it's going to work when user tries to log in. We don't have to inject that cookie from the browser or from browser JavaScript. That should happen from the server, because API usually will have a separate subdomain. So we have to insert that for a cross-domain access even within the same domain namespace. For that, inside this controller, in login controller, I'm going to use the standard wrapper function called res. And this response actually can be passed through. This response object will be the only part where we will essentially force set the cookie. Cookies.set, and this user token is going to be assigned This user token is going to be signed JSON web token, and we also can tweak a bit the parameters, how this is going to work. Here we can set the expire time when this cookie should expire. This should be pretty much ready to go. And now when we restart our server, let's fix the ESLint. This sometimes breaks. So now we have the user token. Let's remove it and try to log in again. Go to out login. Now we got internal server. Okay, so cannot read properties of undefined reading set. Okay, so we don't have cookies here. Oh, okay, so this is not a standard store. Yeah, we have to set a res cookie as a standard function. So yeah, this was from the old Express version. So after having this set, let's try again. And now you can see that I reloaded the page authentication login and got back the user token. And whenever we hit next, we already have the user token available here. So the last part will be the making an actual logout screen, which is going to be a simple function that essentially cleans the cookie, but not with the clear function. Instead, it is going to be setting a cookie. This is the best way of doing it. Instead of having separate functions, we actually have to set expires now. This alerts the browser to essentially remove this cookie right after this request, because it kind of counts that this cookie should be already expired. So now we have to make sure that we are just setting the empty string and the options will be expired. And we can go back again to out logout. Now we have removed user cookie. As you can see, it's quite easy to manipulate the Nest.js code, and also having this type of cookie-based authentication makes you quite flexible on deploying API on a separate subdomain and your web application on the main subdomain, and even use in multiple subdomains across many devices, but using the same API, using the same cookie-based authentication, which means front-end developers don't have to care about cookies. They just have to send a request, and whenever they have a properly formatted request after login, the cookies will be sent directly to API endpoint, and they don't have to manage the state of user login